The truth about the FIRE movement.
It's Brian Preston, the money guy.
Brian, I am excited about this because the world has changed a little bit. Right now, things seem a little iffy, and so a lot of people are asking the question, is FIRE even still possible? I mean, it was this dream, it was this vision, this idea, this thing that we wanted to do, but some circumstances have changed, and there are a number of the things that we're going to talk about. So can I still do FIRE? Can I still participate in that movement?
Now, before we get started, I feel like we first need to give everyone a recap.
Sure.
And look, I hate when people just assume everybody knows what acronyms stand for. Tell everybody, what is FIRE?
Yeah, FIRE is a financial movement. It stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early, and it involves saving and investing much more than the average so that you can retire earlier. It's this idea of, I want to exit the workforce or have the freedom to exit the workforce as early as possible so I can get on to doing the things that I actually want to be doing.
And by the way, that also means you're willing to take some pretty extreme savings habits and other behaviors to ensure that you do have those options in the future. But Bo, it goes beyond that, because I think there's a lot of times we take movements and we just group them all together. FIRE is kind of unique because it's got a bunch of different elements and different structures.
Yep, there's obviously the financial independence part, there's the retire early part, and as we're going to talk about later in the show, there's even some different strains. There are some different ways that FIRE might actually apply to you. So I think, if that's sort of the backdrop of what it is and what the movement is, we should talk a little bit, Brian, about how it's changed. What are some things that are sort of new in recent history that have impacted or affected the overall FIRE movement?
So the first thing I'd like to talk about is kind of this whole concept of FIRE, because financial independence has been something that's been around for a long time.
Yep.
I mean, now it's been rebranded as this with the whole retire early part, but you've heard about, and just excuse I'll use a pretty dirty acronym that you hear people, is like the FU money and other things like that. No, but seriously, that is what financial independence. A lot of people say you do life on your terms. You don't have to listen to anybody. How is that different from what FIRE is?
Yeah, we've always advocated that. We've always said that the process of trading your time for money until you can then trade your money for time is the definition of building financial independence. That's what our clients who even work with us on the wealth management side, that's what they do. That is what they are working towards. But it seems like right now, if you're part of this movement, part of this retiring early idea, this financial independence as soon as possible idea, there have been a lot of distractions thrown at you recently.
Yeah, I mean, because I think the formula for success with financial assets is, use your earnings heavily towards saving and investing so it can grow and your money can become more powerful than you can with your back, your hands, and your back. However, there's a lot of this. I mean, think about cryptos, NFTs, SPACs. I mean, all these things. How is this played into FIRE?
Yeah, there have been a lot of popular voices out there in the community starting to give people sort of this idea of how can you get there quickly? So, here's this couple retired at 29 on an $88,000 salary. Millennials look to crypto to retire early. Want to retire early? Include Bitcoin in your investment portfolio. So a lot of people are talking about these new age, new ways to invest that might ultimately lead you to being able to have financial independence early. But we think, and it's been proven here a little bit lately, that if you're doing this, perhaps you're playing with FIRE. Get it? Pun intended. You see what I did there?
I see it. So the thing, Bitcoin went all the way up to like 69,000. It's right around $20,000 right now. Do you have any specific examples of people who've fallen into the trap?
Yeah, so there's a popular blogger who started blogging about this in 2015. He was going to start using crypto to be part of his FIRE journey, and specifically, he was using Bitcoin. And normally, we wouldn't have problems with that being a portion or a part of your portfolio, but this is what happened with him. He started putting his money in Bitcoin, and Bitcoin ran up and ran up and ran up to where at the peak, it was over a third of his entire portfolio, his entire investment portfolio. And the appreciation of Bitcoin is the thing that allowed him to get to FIRE early. but he never de-risked. He never actually backed off. He never actually took some of his chips off the table. Now, fortunately, he had some other assets, and it was only a third, not an entirety of his portfolio, but he has been very forthcoming that the emotional roller coaster that he rode from being super, super flush, and then now with what happened with Bitcoin, being absolutely hammered, it has been a trying time, especially when you're trying to live in the independence mode. Being very dependent on the prices of your assets on a roller coaster is not where you want to be.
Well, I want to tell everybody who's part of this financial independence movement that when you especially are trying to leave the workforce so early, every year has to have a purpose. And I don't want anybody getting distracted by this fool's gold or cutting the corner off of an edge, because I've seen so many people. Here's what I think is interesting. And I've watched people who have really good content right off the get-go on Twitter and so forth. And then they find out some of the best referral programs or affiliate link programs are tied to some of these get rich or corner cutting schemes.
Yep.
And you see their entire outlook change and their messaging and everything. I just don't want anybody to fall prey to where you lose focus on let's get the fundamentals right, because every year has to have a purpose if you're going to be part of this FIRE movement. So don't let somebody side rail you with something that seems too good to be true.
So a lot of people want to talk about the accumulation side of it. They want to talk about how can I get there? How can I get there? We want to remind you, if you are trying to be on this journey, if you are trying to get to financial independence, at least by our estimation, in our opinion, financial independence really boils down to one variable, and that variable is consumption. How much do you spend, or how much does it take for you to be able to live the lifestyle that you want to live for the rest of your life? Financial independence is being able to consume in the way that you want to without someone else dictating what you have to do with your time.
Well, consumption, you better know what you're spending. I mean, and I think this is the big part of it, is because you have to know what makes you happy. I mean, that's one of the things. We have some content coming up where we're going to talk about when is it okay to spend. And I think anybody who's got a very aggressive strategy that they want to leave the workforce early, you can't skip any steps on the homework. And consumption's a big part of that. But you first need to kind of know, what is the vision you're trying to create? Because, Bo, there's very minimalistic people out there.
Sure.
I've watched all type of content where people are essentially living the van life. And then I've also seen people who are saying, no, I don't want any compromises. I'm just going to go work in the highest paying career I can.
Sure.
So I have the biggest shovel possible, but I'm going to save a ton of it so that I don't cut my consumption or my lifestyle at all when I hit retirement.
Yeah, you're actually getting into some of the different strains of FIRE that exist. And what's so common amongst all these strains, and we'll talk about them, is that in order to know what your number is, and your number being that magical thing that you have to hit to be able to actually hit financial independence, you have to have a beat on consumption. But consumption is not the same for everyone. That's exactly what you're alluding to, Brian. There are different strains of FIRE. Like there's Barista FIRE. This is the idea that you want to be financially independent while using a part-time job for additional income or supplemental income or maybe health insurance benefits. Then there's Lean FIRE. I feel like this one gets a lot of the press. These are the folks who want to be as frugal as possible. These are the minimalists who want to get their spending down as low as they can. They're collecting, ketchup packets at the fast food restaurant, that type of idea, so that they can consume as little as possible. And then there's this third strain, and I think this is probably the one that we resonate with the most, Brian, and this is what the majority of our clients look like, whether they're part of the retire early camp or not. Those, and most often that we interact with, that want to achieve financial independence would be classified as fat FIRE. What they desire is for their standard of living in financial independence to match their standard of living while they're working. They don't necessarily want to have to cut back or pare back or have to work more. They truly want their Army of Dollar bills to work just as hard as they worked while they were in the workforce.
So I think the first thing we have to kind of make sure we are respecting and doing well is budgeting.
Yep,
I know
right.
Nobody wants to hear that, but I don't even think you can consider yourself part of this unless you've done the homework of knowing actually what's coming in, what's going out, what are you actually spending, because you can't, and you said it earlier, you can't know your number.
That's
you can't
right.
plan for it unless you actually know what your burn rate is, what the spending is. Do not skip that step. I want you to actually, I don't care if you have to use worksheets. I don't care if you have to use, you need a budget. There's mobile apps now that make this easy. Do not skip the budgeting step.
So if consumption is what defines financial independence, then savings and investing is what defines the timeline. How quickly you're able to get there is really a function of your savings rate. How committed to this goal can you be? And so we thought it'd be really interesting to lay out sort of a case study, what investing more can do for you. And so we have two potential FIRE proponents. We have Steady Steve, and then we have FIRE Felicia, who's really committed. They both make $100,000 a year. Steady Steve wants to invest 20% of his gross income for retirement. That's kind of like this tried and true steady idea of saving. FIRE Felicia knows that in order to retire early, she has to save more so that she can get there sooner. So she invests 40% of her gross income for retirement. Let's assume that they both earn the same rate of return, and let's be very, very conservative. Let's say that they earn 6% annually over the time that they're trying to commit to this savings goal. The question you have is how soon can they reach financial independence? Well, first, you have to define what is financial independence. So we looked at 3 different standards of living: 60% of their pre-retirement income, 80% of their pre-retirement income, and then 100%. Well, if you look at those two savings rates, 20% versus 40%, Steady Steve takes 28 and a half years to get to financial independence. FIRE Felicia, who's saving twice as much, gets there in under 20 years.
Wow.
In order to replace 80% of their pre-retirement income, Steady Steve has to work for 32 years to do that. FIRE Felicia only has to work for about 23 years to get there. And then finally, if you want to be part of like Fat FIRE, you want 100% of your post-retirement income to match 100% of your pre-retirement income, it takes Steady Steve about 35 years, a full working career to get there. FIRE Felicia is able to do it in 26. Your savings rate matters.
So that's where I guess the sacrifice or the discipline really comes in. And I guess you put an asterisk or a bold face as the part of the FIRE movement is these are people dedicated. These are people that are really pushing hard on, hey, can I really defer as much gratification, save, invest as much as possible so I hopefully can control my life and my variables much sooner in the process.
Now, I want to pause for a moment, Brian. I want to go a little bit off script here and talk about this because one of the great things that you've done for me in my life, when I've been super motivated, super driven, had this idea that I wanted to save a ton, you always say, hey, it's important, slow down and smell the roses. Slow down to take in what's going on right now. And I do worry with some of our FIRE folks, perhaps they might not recognize the cost associated with this kind of behavior. You want to speak to that maybe a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's pretty common, achiever mentalities. Because from a young age, people who are wired to be this disciplined, you're probably constantly going through mental checklists. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. I got to hurry up and get through this list so I can get to the next list. And we all just know that happiness is just right over the curve and we can get through this as fast as possible. The problem with that is you go recognize you only get your 20s once. That's right. You only get your 30s, your 40s. And that's what I just don't want people. I want you to look back at all your decades. Take it from somebody who has success, but also gets to look back with fondness over the decade of my 20s and my 30s. It's great. I'm so happy for everybody who's dedicated and disciplined enough to where you really are creating this great, big, beautiful tomorrow for yourself and your family to reach these goals so much earlier than the general public. However, just make sure you're bedazzling your basic life in a way so that you are still traveling, you're still building memories. Because I don't want you to get to 50 or even 45 because you'll figure out really quick. You get very sentimental in your 40s. I don't want you to go look back and go, what was I doing?
Why did
I do this? I'm not going to die broke. I'm so disciplined. I've invested so much. That but I do respect. I think it's incredible that people are building independence because I can tell you this: life is fun when you have kind of done the steps early, so that you actually get to control where you're doing things. And here's the thing: I think it's liberating. I think I have had more success because I now get to make decisions that are not necessarily monetarily driven. They can be more purpose driven, and that's really opened it up to where I can take some crazy risks that I don't think the typical person can do because they're tied to the paycheck to pay the bills.
So if we know that consumption is what kind of defines where financial independence exists for us, and we know that savings rate is the timeline or how we get there, the question we're trying to answer today is FIRE still possible? What are the things that are taking place right now today, and how might that be affecting my ability to retire early? How might that be something that has an impact on that? So we thought it'd be interesting to look through, okay, what are some things taking place right now? What are some things that are present that are helping people in their FIRE journey? What are sort of like the wind in the sails that are advantages right now? And one of the very easy ones is like technology. It's really, really easy to think about how technology has changed the whole world. But specifically, as it relates to the financial independent and retire early movement, technology has very much changed the way that you can go about even creating income for yourself.
Yeah, I love the innovation. Technology is making us all have more options and opportunities. One of the things that's going on right now that's got everybody, it's captured kind of pop culture and society, is this fondness for looking back to the 1980s. I mean, you think about how popular the Top Gun Maverick is right now. You think about Stranger Things. And what are they doing Stranger Things to grab us all is that the side hustle or the way you make extra money in the past, the reason they can reach us so easily with nostalgia is because we're all doing the same thing. There was no choices. So a side hustle 20 years ago, like for myself, by the way, we should have gone back further than 20 years because I've been doing this for 20 years. We'd have to go back a few more decades to get to when I was working at Hardee's in fast food. And look, my mom was a school teacher, and it was not uncommon during all of the holidays that all the school teachers, you would go to Walmart, and a lot of the school teachers during the Thanksgiving or Christmas holiday breaks were working at Walmart in the cashier department or doing other things. And of course, there's things like cleaning. These things have been going on, but it's a whole new world now. And if you want to generate additional income, it's not these basics.
Yeah, what I think is so interesting is that these vocations 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even 40 years ago required a lot of your time, and there were some location parameters. You had to show up at Hardee's to be the crew chief. Well, now side hustles can be done from your bedroom, whether it's selling a business selling items on eBay, web development, copywriting, graphic design, freelance. A lot of these things can be done in your spare time, and a lot of them can be incredibly lucrative. So where it was very difficult 30, 40 years ago to go out and create a side income in addition to the job you're working for your normal day job, that's just not the case today. It is much more easy to go out and to create additional income that ultimately can lead to additional savings.
Yeah, and like DoorDash. I mean, we have folks here that, because it's one of those things where if you just have some extra time, you can go make some extra money. It didn't used to be like that. You had to do a lot more commitment. You had to go through a whole process. So I love that innovation has created that. Let's talk about also another innovation or technology thing. I mentioned earlier, and I kind of alluded to this, budgeting. I mean, I want you guys to go back and look at the personal finance books that I first looked at. And the way you would budget is you'd go to the very back of this book that you bought, and there'd be worksheets.
And you'd rip out
at the back. You'd either have to, cut it out, rip it out, or you'd have to take it to work with you and try to,
make a copy with the
break the crease it, and you'd have to photocopy so you could do budget worksheets. Now you have mobile apps that not only can you go and custom, in a custom way, put in your expenditures, you can also just download the transactions, bring them in. So you don't, it's more of a monitor, like a CFO of your own personal finances versus you have to be a bookkeeper, the CFO. We've really cut the corner in a lot of good ways.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because of the way technology has changed the world. I think back then people said, I don't know how to budget. I don't really understand it. Now, if you can use a smartphone, you can budget because the apps make it incredibly easy. They make it incredibly intuitive. They actually bring the transactions in for you. And all you have to say is, this was groceries. This was going to the laundry store. I don't know what a laundry store is.
It's a laundromat.
A laundromat. You don't go buy laundry
I've been to a laundromat all through college.
It'll actually categorize and classify that for you. So if you're not budgeting or you're someone who maybe doesn't have an eye on what you spend, you should start paying attention to this, because how on earth can you know how much you need to spend if you don't know what you're actually spending right now? Technology has made that much easier.
Hey, well, this was not in the show notes, but when you just threw out this whole laundromat thing, just to give you a little perspective, I think now if you went to a laundromat, everybody's going to be on their own personal phone, probably have AirPods in or whatever, listen to it. Back when I was, in the day, I'll just say back in the day.
Back in your day?
You could go to a laundromat, they'd have movies playing.
Oh, so you just sit there and watch a movie.
They'd set a VCR up, and it would be loud enough. So, because remember, we didn't all have mobile phones that were doing stuff.
Our entire content team just said, "What's a VCR?"
Yeah, but that's. I just want you to know that's once again back to Stranger Things. How we're all doing the same stuff. That is nostalgic because we were forced, because technology didn't allow us to have a lot of variation. Take advantage of the cool stuff, and that leads to, and this is really powerful. Investing has gotten so much easier. There's not been a better time to be alive to be an investor, because look, when I started even investing for myself, because I came out working in public accounting, I mean, the first fund I bought had a deferred sales charge that went down every year.
And how'd you buy it? Were you able to just go online?
No, I had
and
to
buy
call
yourself?
one of my coworkers' roommates was selling things for John Hancock Insurance, and he sold me a mutual fund, and it had a deferred sales charge. It had an internal operating expense of 2.5%. It was expensive. Guys, now you can buy index funds that are as close to free as, there's even some that are actually labeled as free. So, I mean, we even had, and I think this is a good point for us to do kind of a case study of what are the benefits that have come because index investing and technology has made it so much easier to get into this now.
Yeah, Brian, you always say when it comes to like index versus active management, there's really sort of three things you can look at that really sort of tilts the scales in the favor of index funds. One is cost. The second is performance, and the third is tax efficiency. Those three things. Well, here's a really easy case study. If you look at the largest actively managed large cap blend fund, it's an American Funds Washington Mutual Fund, versus just a large S&P 500 index, and we just use Fidelity as an example. The American Fund's internal expense ratio is 0.58%. Certainly less expensive than 2% you noted when you started investing. But when you compare that to the internal expense ratio of the S&P 500 at Fidelity, it's 0.015%. So it is a fraction of the cost. Well, then you can compare the performance, even in a really strong, really positive bull market over the last 3 years, the last 5 years, and the last 10 years. The index has outperformed the actively managed fund. And then you can look at the third thing, the turnover ratio, and that just determines how often are they buying and selling inside of the fund, which leads to tax efficiency or inefficiency. Right now, inside of the American Funds Washington Mutual Fund, it has a 19% turnover ratio. The Fidelity S&P 500 has a 2%. So you're naturally going to have less capital gains distributed out to you in the index fund.
So I love it when we do case studies or comparisons. I do want to kind of clarify, because I asked the team in the content meeting, I was like, why did we choose this fund? Yeah. I want to make sure nobody thinks we're picking on American fund. It's the largest. So that's what they grabbed, the largest. And then I always, because typically we show up a slide that shows, especially if you go to long-term, like 10, 15-year annual, it doesn't matter which asset class you look at, large cap, international, small cap, about 80% of the time, the index fund outperforms a lot of the active management peers. And it makes sense. I mean, we just in quick review, the internal expenses fraction, it costs just pennies compared to the money that you'd have to spend with an active manager. You can see the performance is strong. And then the taxes, it's so much lower because they just don't have the distributions on an index fund that you would with the active manager. Take advantage of that. Harness that power.
Okay, so we talked about how technology has made it easier to go do side hustle and create income. It's made it easier to budget. There are tools at your disposal. It's made investing less expensive. Another thing that's really interesting, and this is very much inside of like recent memory, inside of present day, is that in this post-pandemic world that we're living in this post-2020 COVID world, this idea of work from anywhere or be able to do not just my side hustle, but even my day job from some other place, some other geography, is becoming more and more and more of a reality.
Yeah, it does feel like we accelerated on the adoption of certain technology. Look, we were one of the early advisors that were working with clients all over the country through Zoom calls, GoToMeeting, and that stuff. Now it just seems so much more normalized.
That's right.
And I think it is interesting, and Daniel found this stat for us, is that 22% expect to be fully remote with their working by the year 2025.
And these aren't like the side hustle gigs. These aren't the people working on their own. These are actually employees, folks that are doing the same job they were doing 5 years ago, just now they're doing it fully remote from their home or from some other geography. It's really amazing how technology has made that possible.
Well, we've actually have a case study or an example, an experience share from an employee that wanted to be part of the FIRE movement and retire earlier. But they also knew they were geographically moving. And it was one of those things where it was like the perfect situation where the employer was like, hey, you're a great employee. I don't want you to leave yet. And the employee's like, yeah, but my family and we want to go ahead and need to move to get the kids in school, change geographic locations. And because of technology, the employer's like, fine, we'll work with you on that. I mean, and that's the thing. So see what opportunities this new modern world we live in kind of provides for you to have more flexibility, more options, and it could help you in this journey to financial independence and retiring early.
No, I think this other benefit, this one is interesting because this is one that I don't think that we talk about a lot. Now, Brian, you and I are fortunate because we have been working with clients for over a decade now remotely. So we saw people doing the FIRE thing before FIRE was cool. And it was really interesting. We have some clients who retired in their early to mid 40s, and they would go out and meet somebody and they'd say, oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, well, I'm retired. I'm like, oh, a tough break, you get laid off. It was just not this common thing. Now there's actually a community of folks. There's an entire, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, I think community or
community,
just, I mean, but it is one of those things where there's now bloggers, there's YouTube. It's a movement. I mean, without a doubt.
There's an entire movement.
There's an entire movement of
idea.
Support of you to get good information on this. And that's a positive thing. Now, I think we've kind of laid out the red carpet on all the good stuff. I mean, because it is an exciting time to be thinking about your options because of technology, innovation, and just unique things that are going on that have made this easier. But let's face reality. There's actually some headwinds also. There are some things that have actually made why is the FIRE journey harder now. Let's talk about a few of these things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The first one that kind of comes to mind is inflation. If you read any sort of financial publication right now, it seems to be a headline because if you are part of the FIRE movement, over the last decade, you've probably been modeling 3% inflation, 4% inflation. Then all of a sudden, we get into 2021, 2022, and those numbers don't apply anymore. Things have changed a little bit. So we said, okay, let's not lose track of the long term. If we want to be really good planners, we got to think long term. And let's look at U.S. inflation rates going all the way back to the 1970s. Well, what you can see is really for the past 40 years or so, we've been in a relatively moderated inflationary period. Yeah, it might get as high as 6% or it might get low to 0%. But by and large, it probably hovers around that average. It does look like right now what we're seeing in this country is unique relative to what we've seen since the late 1970s.
It's 40 years. I mean, 40 years since we've had inflation moments like this, that obviously is going to, because think about best laid plans is you have to put your assumptions in of what you think life will look like since you are leaving the workforce early. Inflation is one of the worst things that you could face.
That's exactly right.
Because it blows up a lot of your assumptions in a lot of different ways. So just be aware of that. And that's a great segue also into the next thing because we all need shelter.
Yep.
I mean, and housing, because of inflation, has gotten substantially more expensive, and that's having a big impact. Here's what I think is interesting, Bo, and I'll let you kind of lay this out. We've had so much growth in housing just in the 2020s. What is this chart that you pulled up actually showing?
Yeah, so we actually show by decade how much housing has increased. So in the 1990s, housing went up about 31%.
Appreciated, the value of a house went up.
Cost of housing. In the 2000s, there's about 45% appreciation over that decade. In the 2010s, there was about 47% price appreciation that decade. In the 2020s, so far, so realize we're on the early end of this. It's 2020, 2021, 2022. We've already seen 42% price appreciation in housing. In really the last 2 years, we have covered the amount of ground that it normally takes a full decade to cover when it comes to real estate value increase. That's problematic, especially for folks who want to relocate and live in a different part of the country.
Now, the glass half empty is that this is just going to keep going and housing. But let me tell you the glass half full. I see if you look at the historical norms, 31, 45, 47, we're already at 42 just in the first 2 to 3 years of this decade. That probably means that housing appreciation is going to be somewhat stagnant. It's not going to move at the same pace.
Reversion
I think
to the mean.
There will be a reversion to the mean, likely. So I would just tell you, hey, hang in there. If you're one of these people that's struggling with the cost of housing and you're trying to figure out how this fits into your plan to be financially independent even earlier than most, I think that there's actually a glimmer of understanding that it's going to be, I think that it will hopefully settle down. That's my glass half full outlook.
What I think is really interesting is that both of these things, both inflation as well as housing, are examples of blind spots that can exist in your financial plan. Well, if you've not accounted for blind spots as best you can, I mean, we only know so many unknown unknowns, and if you've not stress tested your portfolio, right now you are probably facing some headwinds. One of the things we do for our clients is we walk through, okay, here's what we think could happen. Here's what we think is a highly probable outcome if you're going to leave the workforce and you're going to retire, whether it's early or on a normal schedule. And then we start playing with variables. Well, what happens if your spending increases? What happens if it decreases? What happens if you retire earlier? What happens if you retire later? What I think is really amazing is that people get this idea in their head, like, okay, here's my goal. I know that I need to live off of $80,000 a year. If I can just get to $1 million, I bet I'll be okay. If I can just hit that 7-figure mark, I'm going to retire and I'm going to sell off into the sunset. Well, if you are a 50-year-old retiring with $1 million, that is very different than a 65-year-old retiring with $1 million. Because you may actually put this into a Monte Carlo software, run through a stress test, and you might say, uh-oh, things don't look quite as good as I thought they were. You want to know this on the front end. Way too often, people get so excited about what financial independence looks like, what life on the other side of the fence looks like, they don't ever take into account the other scenarios, like what happens if inflation is worse than I expected? What happens if spending is higher than I planned? Now, what happened if the cost of housing is different than I expect? These all have very real ramifications on the viability of your plan for the long term.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where, look, we're in the content space where we give great information to help you accelerate that whole learn, apply, grow to reach your own level of success. But there are limits to it because general advice, general planning, napkin financial plans that you can do through safe withdrawal rates, they do reach their limits, especially as you're about 5 years from retirement. You need to have some way to stress test. You need to have some way to make sure what are you not protected from that you just are unaware of, because you're doing one retirement. Having somebody in your court that's done hundreds of them, it can that knowledge, that skill set can be very helpful. So just be careful. Pay attention to blind spots. Be careful of overconfidence, because that's the one thing we talked about. The positive of having this community, there also can be this overconfidence. Because I will tell you, if you type in there that you're talking to a financial advisor or anything, the FIRE movement is notorious for throwing shade, because I think all they think financial planners do is asset allocation. And I'm like, yeah, you can go we actually use index funds. Anybody can use index funds. If you're just buying VTI all the time, if you total market index or something like that, you're probably like, what would a financial planner do for me? Trust me, complexity, life decisions, especially big financial life decisions, will happen naturally. Roth conversions, how the impact of Social Security plus your retirement withdrawals, the Medicare, premiums, and how all that plays. There's a lot of complexity that's going to happen that you'll eventually want to make sure you have a co-pilot to take it to the next level.
A second ago, Brian, you said overconfidence. That reminds me of another thing we often see in the FIRE community. We often take for granted when we are in our peak earning years that it's really easy to get back on that treadmill. Okay, well, I'm going to try this, and if it doesn't work, I'll just hop right back in. I can't tell you how many folks we've had who've told us, man, I worked in this career field for 15 years, 20 years, and I got out. And the rate and the speed at which technology changes, 2 to 3 years in the future, my skills were obsolete. If I was not in it, I was losing that. So make sure before you make that big decision to exit, you understand the ramifications, because getting back in the game may not be as easy as you think that it is.
Yeah, I mean, this wasn't in what we had talked about, but my next door neighbor, he had sold a portion. He worked in an IT company, had sold that, and then was working in like sales for a few years while he's waiting for his non-compete to play out. He's now back at another company. And even at dinner, he was like, I forget the speed that this industry moves. I mean, and it's one of those things. So, and you made a key point a few seconds ago. Peak earning years, if you statistically, it's your late 40s, early 50s. Well, I know the FIRE movement, that's kind of when a lot of the people are trying to leave. Just be careful because those are your peak earning years. And you just want to make sure you measure twice, cut once, do it well, plan well, so you don't have something derail your best well-intentions, but just because you didn't do all the work.
Yeah, I think another headwind that we're seeing, obviously, that you ought to think about if you're part of the FIRE movement, is there are big life checkpoints that are happening later and later. When you look at the statistics right now, the median age for a first marriage is now 30 years old for women, 30 years old for men, 29 years old for women. 50 years ago, this was not the case. The median age of first-time homebuyers is now 33. That's much later than it has been historically. And then if you look at the average age that couples or women specifically have their first child, it's usually around 27 years. So if you're having some of these major life-altering, life-changing events happen later in life, it's likely going to push your timeline out. So you need to make sure if you are part of the FIRE movement or if you desire to be part of the FIRE movement, you understand where these big life changes fit into the overall plan.
Well, anybody who's part of this movement will know some of the biggest people who have been the most vocal, the content creators, where they've actually fallen back into the workforce is because of life. It's these things right here. Because look, if you're getting married later, if you're buying your house later, if you've got kids in the house much later, there's a lot of things that can change there, where daycare cost of college, if you have a special needs child out of the blue, all these things can have a huge impact on the tell of what your life and financial decisions are. Make sure that's built into the process. Now, Bo, I'm excited to kind of talk about this next thing because this is the nerdiness that we're built for.
Yep.
And I know that within the FIRE movement, this is the type of stuff that my financial mutants who are considering leaving the workforce early, you love to nerd out on this stuff. And we didn't want you to think we weren't going to throw some numbers in here, but sequence of return risk. I mean, look, we're right now in the middle of a downturn. We're full on bear market.
Yep.
A lot of indicators saying we might be in a recession right now. That's kind of scary if you're one of these people thinking about leaving the workforce, especially in your best earning years. Talk to us about sequence of return.
Yeah, if you've read any sort of financial media or FIRE media, you know one of the hottest button topics is the time at which I choose to retire matters. And I could be very, very lucky in that timing, or I could be very, very unlucky in that timing. And we want to show you a very practical example, again, using a case study. Let's say that you have two investors. One of them wants to retire on January 1st of 2000. The other wants to retire on January 1st of 2003. They are both going to retire with $2 million. So we're going to assume the same portfolio value, just different time of when they leave the workforce. They're also both going to have the same income needs. They're going to withdraw 5% or $100,000 annually from their portfolio. So on the cuff, it doesn't sound crazy. 5% withdrawal rate, $2 million portfolio. I think what you have to think about is when you retire, when you go into financial independence, there's a psychological shift that takes place. And we see this time and time again with our retirees, that when you can no longer use your hands and your back and your brain to go out and make money, and now you have to count on your army of dollar bills to work for you, there is a shift that happens. And we were with people in the Great Recession when this was going on. And I want you to imagine you're in that moment. Investor A, in the downturn of 2009, at the very low part of 2009, the one who retired right before the dot-com bubble bursting, saw their portfolio value that was at $2 million at retirement drop down to $993,000. So you have to believe they're starting to think, oh man, I'm pulling $100,000 a year out of my portfolio, and I've now crossed below that $1 million mark. This is frightening. This is scary. Just using simple arithmetic, I don't know how much longer this will last. Investor B, on the other hand, because they got quote unquote lucky and didn't retire right before a downturn, On March of 2009, their portfolio is actually worth $1.3 million.
Yeah, it is one of those things where I think a lot of people, we look at this and we just assume I've saved up this chunk of money, I will be okay. Mm-hmm. But we don't realize the stress. I mean, it is hard going from builder, meaning you've always been saving, you're very disciplined, to now consumer or destroyer of the wealth that you, because in a way, in a sad way, you are kind of going the other way with it, where now you're breaking down what you spent decades building. And that's just a hard general mindset. And you think about when you hit market cycles where the economy's in a downturn and people are struggling, it's not uncommon for you to have a psychological coping mechanism, especially if you're working. When the market starts getting beaten up, you're like, it's okay. I'm not retiring yet. I'm going to keep saving. I'm taking advantage. I'm a financial mutant. I'm buying cheap shares right now. But think about the fact that once you've left the workforce, it hits you from a psychological standpoint of a much more desperate feeling, and the fact that now you are not in control. And there's something about humans and our ability to want to control the situation, to control all the angles that are coming in, and you will feel very helpless and very vulnerable from this. And then to know that, because here's the other thing I think is interesting. Somebody starts at $2 million. They start living off these assets for a decade. And you've 10 years in the future, now that those assets are already down, because you've consumed the principle of it. That is a very scary thing, because if you're still pulling the $100,000 a year, you're way beyond that 5% safe withdrawal rate that you originally started retirement at. Now, look, I hate being a pessimist, so let's turn this around and talk about the glass half full. I tell this to my clients right now too. Sometimes facing from a contrarian standpoint, when we're in the middle of a bear market, it could be also a tailwind to your back, meaning that this could actually be an opportunity, as if we boomerang back with our V-shaped recovery, that this might actually work out pretty good. So we've given them all the negative stuff, Bo, by showing that their asset values have gone down. If you were historically going back in time to 2000 to 2009, what's the rest of the story if these people stayed invested?
Yeah, the rest of the story now, with hindsight being 2020, is the investor who retired right before the dot-com bubble burst. Their portfolio recovered value. As of June of this year, with a 60-40 portfolio, they'd have about $1.6 million. So their plan worked. Now, they didn't know that in March of 2009, but they worked. But look at this. The investor who timed it right, who retired with lower sequence of return risk, they actually have $2.7 million as of June of this year. That is a $1.1 million difference in retirement assets by factoring in and understanding the way that sequence of return risk works. This is why people tell you the first few years of retirement, first few years of financial independence are some of the most important to make sure you don't draw down the portfolio.
Now look, you said something there, and I don't know if you meant to say it, but you said who timed it right. But nobody can time it.
Nobody knows.
Let's just say it. They got lucky.
They got lucky.
So let's make sure. How can we get rid of as much luck or chance out of this scenario as possible? I think the best way for us to do that is to look at the safe withdrawal rate. Remember, now, the best, as you get closer to retirement, you're going to talk to somebody, you're going to stress test this, you're going to run it through Monte Carlo simulations. But if you're still decades from retirement, it is important to kind of look at this, understand this concept of safe withdrawal rate, because that is what's going to keep you from consuming the principal as you retire. And we've actually got a lot of research here that we want to kind of show you on why it makes sense to pay attention to how long your retirement is to what you actually pull out of your portfolio.
Yeah, it's interesting. If we are retiring earlier, and then because of advances in medical technology, we're living longer, our retirements are expanding, so safe withdrawal rate has to become something that we think about. There's a great chart. This was done by thepoorswiss.com, and this is just kind of the Trinity study that kind of tested and sort of benchmarked the 4% withdrawal rate, shows how the success rate of withdrawal rates lasts over a 30-year retirement from 1871 all the way till 2021 with different portfolio allocations, 100% bonds, 25% stocks, 50% stocks, 75% stocks, and 100% stocks. If you look at all of these portfolios and you're aiming for a probability of success somewhere above 75, you can see that the safe withdrawal rate for most of these portfolios is between 4 to 4.5 years, 4 to 4.5% if you're thinking about a 30-year retirement. But for financial independence retire early, they're not thinking about 30-year retirements.
Yeah, by the way, this is one of those things, I love when people are just as nerdy as us. I mean, because the Poor Swiss has actually created a really valuable resource here in the fact that the historical Trinity study was based on a 30-year retirement. Man, remember, it came out at 4% safe withdrawal rate, but they came back later and said, if you have over 50% of your assets in risk assets, if you add some asset allocation, diversification in there, and then based upon what's been going on with recent market performance, it's actually been increased up to about 4.5%. And I think it's amazing if you just look at this, somewhere between the 50 to 75% stock portfolio lines here, you can see how beautiful that 4.5% rate, because I really say you don't have success if you look at that success rate unless it's well over 75%. Right. Because who wants to lead the workforce while you're in your peak earning years if you only have a 50-50 coin toss chance of having success? No, you want to make sure that definitely the needle's pointing towards you can do this. So 30 years, we know that the kind of gold standard is about 4.5% safe withdrawal rate. Now, the problem, Bo, and you and I have had a lot of conversation on this, life expectancies are going up, plus people are retiring earlier, especially when they're part of this movement of the financial independence, retire early. What happens when you extend this out to 50 years? Yeah,
you can see the Poor Swiss, again, he updated his chart showing the 50-year results from 1871 to 2021. And you can see that every one of these allocations actually shifted left. If we exclude the completely conservative 100% bond portfolio and you look at the success rate to be above 75%, it's actually somewhere between 3.5 to 4.5%. So 4.5 is no longer the standard. It's kind of the higher end of the safe with sustainable withdrawal rate over the long term. So this means that our guidelines for how we look at safe withdrawal rate probably ought to be affected by how long we anticipate and think that we're going to be in retirement.
And that leads to kind of a good closing point here on that. I think if you want to ensure the best chance that you will have enough to weather whatever financial storm the markets throw at you, is be more conservative on that safe withdrawal rate when you're doing your planning. We've actually put together kind of some guidelines here to let you think about how long you'll be retired and what that means, what you should do using your planning rates.
Yeah, so this is taking this data and putting a little money guy sprinkle on it. We think if your retirement's going to be less than 30 years, 4% sustainable withdrawal rate likely makes sense for planning purposes. If you're going to be retired from 30 to 40 years, you should drop your withdrawal rate to 3.5%. From 41 to 50 years of retirement, you should look at a 3% safe withdrawal rate. And if you're someone who's planning on being retired from 51 to 60 years, you should probably think about a 2.5% withdrawal rate to make sure that you get to be in control of what financial independence looks like instead of having circumstances around you control what the rest of your life looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I love that we got to nerd out a little bit on this, but I still think it comes back to something because that's all analytics. Let's talk about something that is so on the other side of the coin, and the fact, and this is something I've struggled with because we've interviewed guests in the past where we talk about retiring early, and they always say one of the most important things you can do is make sure you know what you're retiring to. That's not right. Retiring from, but what you're retiring to, and that brings into focus what's your why? What brings you happiness? What are your hobbies? What are you doing? I don't know if everybody has spent a lot of time on that. I think a lot of the FIRE movement has spent a lot of time on the analytics.
And what they don't like.
Yeah, but have they gotten to know what they're going to?
Yeah, we actually have a tool that I would encourage you to go check out. If you go to moneyguide.com/resources, we just call this the Money Guy Guide to Retirement, but you could change retirement to financial independence, the Money Guy Guide to Financial Independence. And it's just sort of 9 things to think through as you begin approaching this, as you begin thinking about what the next stage and phase of your life looks like. In our experience working with a number of successful folks who've crossed over that threshold of financial independence, I would say one of the biggest indicators of success is not the size of the portfolio, not the amount of wealth, not the amount of success. It's how clear their vision was for the next stage of life that allowed that part of their life to be super, super fulfilling and a super awesome time as part of their financial journey.
Guys, we love bringing this type of content to you so you can make sure you have a plan. You get to be the best version of yourself financially. There's nothing wrong. I love overachievers and people who really have done a great job of being disciplined, but don't neglect that step of knowing exactly what does your plan look like. Has it been stress test? Do you have a co-pilot to make sure you are addressing all the things you don't know? And I've said this is an echo. You're probably looking at your first and only retirement. Mm-hmm. We've done hundreds. So take advantage of our experience. Consider taking the relationship to the next level. I want to go ahead and go to aboundwealth.com. We have a work with us. Now, maybe you're early in the journey. You just know this is aspirational. I want to retire early. I want to do this right. Go take advantage of all the free resources. We just showed you one of them. Go to moneyguy.com/resources. That's all the free stuff. You just go in there, look at all the things. We have the money multiplier. We have the financial order of operations. So we obviously have this guidebook to help you with what retiring is. But here's what I like. I would encourage you, if you need to accelerate, because the FIRE movement needs to accelerate their success because they only have a limited window. Every year needs to be very purposeful. You might need to consider looking at some of our tools that we have on learn.moneyguy.com. We have a net worth tool with a great dashboard to tell you how well you're doing with things, as well as the financial order of operations course. Let's accelerate that success so you have the best version, the best retirement that you possibly can. I'm your host, Brian Preston, Mr. Bo Hansen, Money Guy Team.